Hello, and welcome to Nation Underdog. I'm Mark Harvey. Today we're going to be talking about rock and roll, and sort of a basic question one might ask, whether you talk about the art of rock or the history of rock, is how it relates to the rest of society, and tied to that issue is the question of what is rock and roll. And so come with me into my office and we'll talk about that for a few minutes. All right, first question is, what is rock and roll? Are we going to define it narrowly, or are we going to define it broadly? For example, the blues. Right? Does that sound like rock and roll? Would that count? Another sort of foundational thing is 1950s style R&B. The basic Earth Angel riff. Earth angel, be mine tonight. You see that throughout the rock and roll, certainly early rock and roll era. Another form is sort of the R&B boogie sound, where you've got like a more upbeat blues sound. Right, which is sort of co-opted by Chuck Berry in songs like Johnny Be Good. Go, Johnny, go, go. Country also sort of a foundational element of rock and roll, but if I played something like this, would that be considered rock and roll? Sort of sang with the twang. Another thing that obviously came out of country and blues as well was rockabilly. These styles are generally considered rock and roll. And then of course there's sort of the folk element as well. We're coming from the Woody Guthrie tradition, which eventually kind of carries on through Bob Dylan and a number of others. Would rock and roll include corporate teen idols from the 1960s that sometimes play within and sometimes outside that stylistic pattern? How about Motown in its clean pop machine? What about the hard soul of somebody like a Wilson Pickett, right? Obviously I don't have a horn section behind me. Think about something like Mustang Sally, right? Mustang Sally. Bet you better slow Mustang down. There's also the Otis Redding approach to ballads, right? Sitting on the sun, I've been sitting in the evening tones. 1960s music got really psychedelic, and that of course didn't sound anything like the original form either. So I mean, if I played something like, you know, so what's the difference between, say, some of the soul that we played and some outlaw country via, say, Waylon Jennings? Where does it go? The good Lord only knows. Seemed like it was just the other day. Right, and that riff, it could be right out of Led Zeppelin, right? I mean, seriously, how is that not rock and roll? Guys like Graham Parsons, who drew directly from Elvis Presley's musicians and, you know, carried on an alt-country tradition that's pretty thriving today. Well, certainly some of that is fairly hard-edged. Does Ryan Adams, for example, count as rock and roll today? How about progressive rock? You take things a step further. You include bands like Rush or Yes. I mean, you'd say, like, yes, they rock. But, I mean, is it really rock and roll in the way it was traditionally defined? I mean, heavy metal clearly has elements of guitar, you know, but does that necessarily mean that it's rock and roll? I mean, it's very far removed from the original reaches of rock and roll, right? Manufactured girl bands and teen girl idols. from the 1960s and beyond. It started really in the early 1960s with, folks like Diana Ross, continues on through Madonna, and then on through moderns like Lady Gaga, or the girl bands, like the Crystals, that sort of have their ultimate outcome in bands like the Spice Girls. Alternative rock, indie rock, Britpop. And then it doesn't even touch on, some of the most dominant music today, like modern R&B or hip-hop, some of the most cutting-edge stuff. And then there's a whole host of electronic music, including house and trance music. Just because it involves teen culture, just because it's modern, does that necessarily make it part of rock and roll? You may ask yourself the question, ultimately, who cares? Maybe the study of this so-called art form is simply the study of the evolution of modern music. And maybe that's okay. But I do think that these are interesting questions that are worth asking yourself, because, all the time we're sort of wondering about, do genres matter? Do they not matter? If everything counts as rock, then what's the distinction? And ultimately, how do institutions such as the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame justify bringing in, say, a Madonna or a Grandmaster Flash, who really are not rock and roll classically defined, but maybe are innovative and trend-setting in such a way that they become defined by rock in a slightly different way, in a way in which they may affect social attitudes differently. So, just because they're pioneers, does that necessarily mean they're rock? At any rate, I don't have answers to these questions, but these are questions that I think are worth your asking, and maybe you'll come up with your own answers throughout the course.